What if the most mysterious man in Russian history suddenly found himself in the Star Trek universe? After surviving an impossible death in 1916, Rasputin is thrown through a temporal rift and awakens aboard Deep Space Nine. But this is no ordinary historical figure. As his mysterious abilities begin to surface, Rasputin quickly discovers the power of the Bajoran prophets and Captain Sisko. Could the mad monk manipulate the people of the station? Could his strange powers rival the forces of the Federation? And what happens when Rasputin realizes that Sisko may be the only man standing between him and unimaginable power? The mad monk has entered the final frontier, and the galaxy is about to discover what happens when faith, power, and manipulation collide. The Neva River did not want him. It was a black, churning throat of ice and silt, swallowing the man whom bullets and poison had failed to claim. Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin, the peasant who had whispered into the ears of czars and held the fate of a crumbling empire in his soot-stained hands, felt the crushing weight of the Russian winter pressing the last of the air from his lungs. His vision was a kaleidoscope of freezing dark and the distant, mocking glimmer of the stars above Petrograd. He felt the heavy chains wrapped around his body, the iron biting into his flesh, dragging him down toward the riverbed. But then, the water didn't just feel cold, it felt impossible. The pressure of the river was suddenly replaced by a violent tearing sensation, as if the fabric of the night itself had snagged on his soul and ripped. The roar of the water was silenced by a high-pitched harmonic whine that vibrated in his very marrow. The darkness of the Neva shattered into a blinding, sterile brilliance. He did not hit the muddy floor of the river. Instead, he collapsed onto a surface that felt like polished bone, hard and unnaturally warm. The air he gasped into his lungs was not the wet, freezing vapor of Russia. It was thin, dry, and smelled of ozone and something scrubbed too clean. "Doctor, we have a localized chronoton spike in the middle of Ward 3. The voice was frantic, melodic, and entirely alien to Rasputin's ears. He coughed, a ragged, wet sound that sprayed the pristine white floor with a mixture of river water and blood. His long, matted beard was a sodden mess against his chest. Through the tangled curtains of his hair, he saw boots. Not the leather of a Cossack or the silk of a noble, but soft, gray-soled footwear that moved with a silent, haunting grace. My God, he's wearing furs. And is that iron chain? Grigory looked up. His eyes, those piercing, pale blue orbs that had mesmerized the Romanovs, were bloodshot and wild, but they had lost none of their terrifying intensity. He saw a man with skin the color of toasted earth and a face of intense, youthful intellect leaning over him. Behind him stood another man, taller, with a shaven head and a uniform of black and deep burgundy that bore a gold insignia that glittered like a fallen star. "I am Dr. Julian Bashir," the younger man said, his voice dropping to a soothing, professional register as he waved a small, blinking silver device over Rasputin's shivering frame. "You're on Deep Space Nine. You're safe. Can you understand me?" Rasputin did not answer in words. He reached out with a hand that was still blue from the frost of 1916, his fingernails jagged and dirty. He grabbed Bashir's wrist. The doctor flinched, not out of pain, but because of the sudden, inexplicable heat radiating from the stranger. The biobed's monitors above them began to scream. Rhythmic pulses of light flashed amber, then red. "His neural activity is off the charts, Captain," Bashir said, his eyes darting to the displays. "It's not just human. It's like he's projecting. I've never seen a neurotransmitter count this high in a non-telepathic species. He's in shock. He's riddled with cyanide. He has 3 gunshot wounds, and he was clearly drowning, but his brain is functioning at a level that should be physically impossible." Captain Benjamin Sisko stepped forward, his gaze heavy and cautious. He had seen many things on this station: prophets in the wormhole, changelings in the shadows, and the horrors of the Dominion. But this man felt like a ghost pulled from the prehistoric mud of his own homeworld. The computer identified his language as a dialect of early 20th century Russian. The universal translator is still calibrating the idiomatic nuances. Rasputin let out a low, guttural moan. To his eyes, he was no longer in the world of men. He was in the belly of a celestial beast, surrounded by icons of glass and light. He saw the doctor as a sort of high priest of this metallic temple. He felt the hum of the station's fusion core vibrating through the floorboards, and to his mystic's mind, it felt like the heartbeat of a god. He didn't know where he was, but he knew power when he felt it. and this place was overflowing with it. Great Tsar. Rasputin wheezed, his voice a dry rattle. He looked at Sisko. He saw the weight of command, the linear nature of the man that the prophets of the wormhole had once remarked upon. Rasputin saw the shadow of a crown upon Sisko's brow, a crown of responsibility and hidden divinity. "I'm not a Tsar," Sisko said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm the commander of this station. You've come through a temporal rift, mister." "Grigory," the man whispered, closing his eyes as a wave of healing sleep, forced by Bashir's hypospray, began to take hold. "I am the servant of the light and the darkness that dwells in the marrow of the bone." As the mad monk drifted into a medically induced coma, the sensors in the infirmary began to stabilize, but the air remained thick with a strange, heavy tension. It was the feeling one gets before a lightning strike. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. The road goes ever on. Hours later, the senior staff gathered in the wardroom. The view screen showed the swirling, majestic colors of the Denorios belt, but the mood inside was grounded in a singular, baffling mystery. "The computer has confirmed his identity through historical archives," Major Kira Neris said, tapping a pad. "Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin, a mystic and political advisor from Earth's Russian Empire. He was supposed to have died in December 1916, assassinated by a group of nobles. The records say he was nearly impossible to kill," Chief O'Brien added, leaning back with a look of skepticism. "They poisoned his cakes with enough cyanide to kill 5 men, shot him several times, beat him, and finally threw him into the river. The autopsy in his own time said he died of drowning, but Bashir's scans suggest something else entirely. He didn't die of drowning because he wasn't there long enough," Bashir explained, pacing the room. "The chronoton surge we detected wasn't just a random rift. It was as if the space-time continuum reacted to his biological signature. But here's the truly incredible part. The cyanide in his system wasn't being processed by his liver. It was being neutralized by a localized field of subatomic energy emanating from his own nervous system. Captain, I don't think Rasputin was just a mystic or a lucky charlatan. I think he is a genetic outlier, a human born with a latent, high-functioning psionic gift that his era simply didn't have the language to describe." "A telepath?" Kira asked. "More than that," Bashir said. "A biokinetic. He was subconsciously keeping himself alive against forces that should have ended him. And now that he's in an environment with high ambient energy, like this station, his abilities are beginning to move from his subconscious to his conscious mind." Sisko looked out at the stars. He's a man from a time of superstition and absolute monarchy, dropped into the middle of a quadrant on the brink of war. He manipulated the most powerful family on Earth in his time. What happens when he starts trying to manipulate a space station? As if in answer, a comms channel opened. It was a frantic Bajoran orderly from the infirmary. "Commander, you need to get down here. The prisoner, the stranger, he's awake." And people are gathered outside the doors. They're saying he's seen the prophets. Sisko and Bashir exchanged a look of grim realization. Rasputin had been on the station for less than a day, and already he had found the rot he needed to climb. The desperate faith of a people looking for a sign. When they arrived at the infirmary, they found Rasputin sitting upright. He was no longer the shivering wretch from the river. He had been bathed, his wild hair combed back, though his eyes remained 2 burning pits of coal. He was surrounded by 3 Bajoran patients and an orderly. One of the patients, a woman who had been suffering from a chronic degenerative nerve condition, was weeping. She was standing, something her medical chart said she shouldn't be able to do for weeks. Rasputin's hand was resting lightly on her brow. He wasn't looking at her, he was looking at Sisko. A slow, knowing smile spread across his lips, hidden by the shadow of his mustache. "The spirit's here," Rasputin said, his voice now amplified by the universal translator into a deep, melodic baritone that vibrated in the chests of everyone present. "They do not live in the sky, great Tsar. They live in the air. They live in the cracks between the seconds. They have told me of you, the emissary." Sisko felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold of the Neva. This man didn't just know his name, he knew his burden. And in the eyes of the mad monk, Sisko didn't see a patient or a refugee. He saw a competitor. The news of the miracle in the infirmary spread through the promenade like a plasma fire in an oxygen-rich Jeffries tube. Deep Space Nine was a station built on the tension between the secular Federation and the spiritual Bajorans, and Grigory Rasputin had just stepped directly onto the fault line. Within an hour, the corridors leading to the medical bay were choked with Bajorans, merchants, monks, and refugees alike, all whispering the name of the Holy One from the ancient world. Sisko stood at the center of the bay, his presence a physical wall between the burgeoning crowd and the man sitting on the biobed. "Dr. Bashir, get these people out of here. This is a medical facility, not a shrine." "I'm trying, sir," Bashir replied, his voice strained as he guided a sobbing man toward the exit. But they saw what he did to Neela. Her synaptic pathways didn't just repair, they surged. It's like he jump-started her nervous system with a burst of pure willpower. Rasputin sat perfectly still, his long, spindly fingers laced over his knees. He was dressed in a simple, off-white Bajoran tunic provided by the staff, but he wore it as if it were a robe of state. His eyes remained fixed on the crowd beyond the transparent doors. He saw their desperation, a hunger for the divine, that reminded him of the starving peasants in the snowy wastes of Tobolsk. These people, with their ridged noses and their earrings of gold and stone, were no different from the Russians who had kissed the hem of his dirty smock. They were broken, and they wanted to be whole. "Why do you fear them, great Tsar?" Rasputin asked, his voice carrying through the room despite being little more than a whisper. The universal translator rendered his words into a resonant, chest-deep bass. "They do not come for bread. They come for the fire that does not burn. They feel the cold of the void, and they seek the warmth of the spirit." "I told you, I'm not a Tsar," Sisko said, turning to face him. "And what you did wasn't the spirit. It was a psionic discharge. We call it science here, Grigory." Rasputin stood up. He was taller than he had appeared when huddled in the river's chains, his frame lanky and imposing. He walked toward Sisko, his gait a strange, gliding motion. "Science is but the name you give to the hem of God's garment. You touch the cloth, and you think you know the man who wears it. But I have seen the face." Before Sisko could respond, Major Kira Nerys pushed through the doors. She looked at Rasputin with a mixture of professional suspicion and the raw, vulnerable faith of a woman who had spent her life praying to the prophets for a liberation that came at a terrible cost. "The Vedeks are asking for an audience," Kira said, her voice unusually quiet. "They say this man's arrival was foretold in a fragment of the prophecies of the Third Age, a stranger of ice and iron, who would heal the wounded land." "Major, surely you don't believe," Sisko began. Rasputin didn't let him finish. He moved toward Kira. Sisko stepped forward to intercept, but Rasputin simply raised a hand. He didn't touch the captain, but Sisko felt a sudden, heavy pressure in the air, a density of intent that made his next step feel like wading through deep water. Rasputin reached out and took Kira's hand. She flinched, her hand flying to the phaser at her hip, but she didn't draw it. The mad monk didn't look at her face. He looked at her palm, his thumb tracing the calluses left by years of holding a phaser and a climbing pick in the mountains of the resistance. "You have carried the mountain on your back, daughter of the stars," Rasputin murmured. He closed his eyes, and a visible shudder went through his body. His skin began to glow with a faint, pale luminescence, the same biokinetic energy Bashir had detected. "The pain is an old friend, is it not? It sits in your heart like a winter bird." Kira's breath hitched. A look of profound, terrifying peace washed over her features. For a moment, the chronic ache in her lower back, a souvenir of a Cardassian interrogation a decade ago, simply vanished. It wasn't just the absence of pain, it was a flood of warmth, a sensation of being seen, not as an officer or a soldier, but as a soul. He touched my peg," Kira whispered, her eyes wide. "He's projecting a localized sedative effect through tactile contact," Bashir noted, though he sounded less certain as he checked his tricorder. "Wait, the cellular inflammation in her lumbar vertebrae is actually receding. He's not just masking the pain, he's stimulating the body's own regenerative proteins at an accelerated rate." Rasputin let go of her hand and turned back to the crowd outside the glass. He raised both arms, his wide sleeves falling back to reveal the scars on his wrists where the chains had bitten deep. "Children of the light," he cried out, his voice now a thunderous roar that echoed through the infirmary and into the promenade. "The sky is no longer a ceiling. The stars are the candles of the Lord. I have come from the tomb of the old world to tell you, the night is over. The Bajorans outside fell to their knees. The sound of their rhythmic chanting, a prayer to the prophets, began to drown out the low hum of the station's computers. Sisko looked at the monitors. The station's internal sensors were flagging a massive surge in neurocortical activity across the entire promenade. It was as if Rasputin was a broadcasting tower, his own high-functioning psionic brain synchronizing with the emotional states of everyone around him. "This is getting out of hand," Sisko muttered. "Security, this is the captain. Clear the promenade and get Mr. Rasputin to the guest quarters in Habitat Ring Level 4. I want 2 guards on his door at all times. No visitors, no Vedex, no exceptions." As Odo's security teams began the difficult task of dispersing the faithful, Rasputin allowed himself to be led away. He didn't resist. He didn't need to. He had already felt the pog of the station. He knew that in this era, gods lived in wormholes and demons lived in fire caves. To a man who had navigated the labyrinthine treachery of the Russian court, the Federation was a naive child, and the Bajorans were a flock looking for a shepherd who wasn't afraid to get his hands bloody. In his new quarters, Rasputin sat on the floor, ignoring the bed and the sophisticated replicator. He watched the stars through the viewport. To his eyes, they weren't burning balls of gas. They were the eyes of the cherubim, watching a new drama unfold. "They think they have locked me in a room," Rasputin whispered to the empty air, his voice thick with a dark, melodic amusement. "They do not realize they have merely given me a pulpit." He reached out his hand toward the replicator. Without touching a button, his mind reached into the machine's subatomic matrix. He didn't understand the physics, but he understood the will of the matter. The air shimmered. The machine hummed and hissed. Instead of the tea Sisko had ordered for him, the tray materialized a small, crude wooden cross and a glass of dark, heavy wine that smelled of the black soil of the Volga. Rasputin took a sip, the fermented heat blooming in his chest. He could feel the eyes of the station's czar watching him through the hidden sensors. He smiled. He would let them watch. He would let them study his blood and his brain. And while they looked at the how, he would show the people the why. The mad monk closed his eyes and began to hum a low, dissonant chant. On the promenade, 3 levels below, the weeping woman who had been healed felt a sudden, sharp clarity. She turned to her neighbor and spoke words she didn't know she knew. "The 3rd seal is broken," she said, her voice a perfect imitation of Rasputin's. "The healer has come to the Iron City." The science lab on Upper Pylon 2 was a cathedral of logic, a place where the chaotic mysteries of the universe were dismantled and reassembled into elegant equations. For Jadzia Dax, it was home. She had lived 7 lifetimes before this one, spanning centuries of discovery, but as she watched Grigory Rasputin walk through the sliding airlock doors, she felt a prickle of something she hadn't experienced in decades. Genuine, primitive unease. It wasn't the man's height or his unkempt appearance. She had met Klingon warriors who looked far more formidable. It was the way he occupied space. He didn't just walk into a room, he seemed to bleed into it, his presence heavy and thick, like a storm front moving over a quiet sea. "Commander, thank you for coming," Dax said, her voice steady as she adjusted the settings on a high-resolution biomolecular scanner. "And Mr. Rasputin, I've read the historical files. Your survival is statistically improbable." Rasputin stopped in the center of the lab, his eyes sweeping over the consoles, the glowing isolinear chips, and the holographic displays. He reached out a long, trembling finger toward a floating 3D model of a DNA helix. "You have caught the lightning," he whispered. "You have put the breath of the Creator into boxes of glass, but you still do not understand what makes the heart beat, do you, little mother?" Dax smiled, her trill spots shifting slightly as she tilted her head. "We understand a great deal, Grigory. We know about neurotransmitters, cellular regeneration, and the way the brain processes external stimuli. What we're trying to understand is how you, a man from the 20th century, are manifesting psionic abilities that rival a trained Vulcan or a high-level Betazoid." Captain Sisko stood by the door, his arms crossed. He had seen the way the Bajorans looked at this man, and he wanted hard data to strip away the miraculous veneer. "Let's get started, Jadzia. Scan him for everything. Neural energy, chronoton residue, subquantum signatures. I want to know if we're dealing with an evolved human or something else masquerading as one." Rasputin allowed Dax to lead him to the sensor platform. He sat with a strange, predatory patience as the blue light of the scanners swept over his body. On the primary monitor, a map of Rasputin's brain flickered into existence. It was a forest of fire. Incredible, Dax muttered, her fingers flying across the touch panel. His parietal lobe is showing activity levels I've only seen in species with natural telepathic arrays. But it's not localized. It's as if his entire nervous system is acting as a single, giant conductor. Ben, he's not just using his brain to think, he's using his body to broadcast. Broadcast what? Sisko asked. Will, Rasputin answered, though he hadn't been asked. He looked at Dax, his gaze boring into her with a terrifying, intimate intensity. The body is a cage, little mother. Most people spend their lives rattling the bars. I simply learned how to step through them. Dax paused. You call me little mother. That's a Russian term of endearment, but there's a weight in your voice. You sense it, don't you? That I'm more than one person. Rasputin leaned forward. The air in the lab grew suddenly cold, and the hum of the computer seemed to drop an octave. I see the ghosts, he said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that made the glass beakers on the nearby shelf rattle. I see the chain of souls stretching back into the dark. You are a vessel, like the golden cups of the altar. One wine is poured out, and another is poured in. But the cup remembers. It remembers the taste of the first vintage. Dax felt a sudden sharp jolt of memory. Not hers, but Layla's, the first host. A memory of a cold wind on a distant moon. It was a thought she hadn't accessed in years, buried under the layers of 6 other lives. You're reading my surface thoughts, she said, trying to maintain her scientific detachment. A common telepathic trick. Is it a trick to feel the hole in the great Tsar's heart? Rasputin turned his gaze to Sisko. The captain stiffened. I see the woman of the desert, the one who was taken by the shadows. You keep her in a box in your mind, but sometimes, when the station is quiet, you open the box and let her screams fill the room. Sisko's face went mask-like, his jaw tightening. He was thinking of Jennifer, his late wife, and the trauma of Wolf 359. That's enough. Dax, what do the sensors say? They say he's spiking, Dax said, her voice trembling. Ben, the equipment is failing. He's drawing power from the station's EPS grid. He's not just reading us, he's using our own emotional energy to fuel his own biofield. Suddenly, the lights in the lab flickered and died. Red emergency lighting kicked in, bathing the room in a bloody arterial glow. Rasputin stood up from the platform. He didn't look like a peasant anymore. He looked like a titan. His shadow, cast against the bulkhead by the red light, seemed to grow, its edges flickering like black flame. You seek the how, but you fear the why, Rasputin said, walking toward Sisko. The captain reached for his comm badge, but his arm felt like it was made of lead. You live in a world of metal and rules because you are afraid of the vast, howling spirit of the universe. You think that because you can measure the stars, you have conquered them. But the stars do not care for your measurements. They hunger for souls. Rasputin reached out and placed a hand on Sisko's chest, right over his heart. Sisko gasped. He didn't feel pain. He felt a sudden, overwhelming surge of existence. Every regret, every hope, every secret shame he had ever carried was dragged into the light. He saw the prophets, not as aliens in a wormhole, but as terrifying, multifaceted beings of pure light. He saw the Dominion War, not as a tactical conflict, but as a sea of blood that would drown the galaxy. Ben? Dax shouted, rushing forward, but an invisible wall of force threw her back against a console. The emissary, Rasputin whispered, his face inches from Sisko's. You are the bridge between the mud and the heavens, but the bridge is cracking. You need a pillar. You need a hand that is not afraid to reach into the fire. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the pressure vanished. The lights hummed back to life, the standard white illumination washing away the crimson shadows. Rasputin slumped, his face suddenly pale and beaded with sweat, looking once again like an exhausted, middle-aged man. He stumbled back to the platform and sat down, breathing heavily. Sisko stood paralyzed for a moment, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at his hands, expecting to see them scorched, but they were trembling. He looked at Dax, who was picking herself up from the floor, her eyes wide with a mixture of scientific fascination and raw terror. The scanners, they caught it all, Dax whispered, checking her pad. Before they overloaded, they recorded a massive burst of exotic particles. Not just psionic energy, it was a localized distortion of the space-time manifold. He didn't just read your mind, Ben. He briefly aligned your neural frequency with the subspace reality of the wormhole. Sisko looked at Rasputin. The man was smiling, a tired, knowing expression. He had shown them that their science was a candle in a hurricane. "Get him back to his quarters," Sisko said, his voice thick and strained. "And Dax, lock those files. Encrypt them with level 10 security. If Section 31 or the Bajoran Council gets a hold of this data, we won't just have a religious crisis. We'll have a war for this man's soul." As the security team led Rasputin away, the mad monk turned back one last time. "The Tsar of Earth will want to see me soon," he said to Sisko. "Tell him I am ready to hear his confession." Sisko watched him go, knowing that Rasputin was right. Word of the miracle worker had already left the station. Subspace messages were flying towards Starfleet Command. The Federation, in its hour of greatest need, as the Dominion threat loomed, was about to be offered a savior they couldn't explain, and a devil they couldn't control. The journey from the edge of the frontier to the heart of the Federation was a blur of warp streaks and sterile shuttle interiors. Captain Sisko had hoped that the transit would allow him to build a rapport with Rasputin, to find the man beneath the myth, but the mad monk spent the entire voyage in a state of unsettling stillness. He sat in the passenger seat of the runabout Rio Grande, eyes closed, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't eat, didn't sleep, and didn't speak. He simply existed, a dark blotch of ancient history against the sleek, Lacars-driven machinery of the 24th century. When they arrived at Starfleet Command in San Francisco, the contrast was jarring. The city was a monument to human achievement, a paradise of white spires, lush greenery, and the shimmering blue of the Pacific. To any other observer, it was the pinnacle of civilization. To Rasputin, as he stepped off the transporter pad, it was a city of ghosts. "It is a beautiful tomb," Rasputin whispered, his voice catching the salt-heavy breeze of the bay. He looked up at the Presidio, where the golden-red towers of the bridge stood as sentinels. "You have swept the dirt from the floors and polished the windows, but you have forgotten how to breathe. There is no sweat here, no blood, no smell of the earth. How can a soul grow in a garden made of light and glass?" "We call it peace, Grigori," Sisko said, though the words felt hollow even to him. He was dressed in his formal dress uniform, the weight of his task pressing on his shoulders. He was handing over a potential biological weapon to the highest authorities in the quadrant. They were met by Admiral William Ross and a security detail that was far more robust than a typical diplomatic escort. Ross looked at Rasputin with the weary, calculating eyes of a man who spent his days looking at casualty reports from the front lines of the Dominion War. He didn't see a saint, he saw an asset. "Captain Sisko, welcome back to Earth," Ross said, his gaze shifting to Rasputin. "And this must be our guest. The Council is waiting, along with representatives from the Vulcan Science Academy and the Betazoid delegation. Everyone wants a piece of the man who can rewrite the laws of physics with his mind." The hearing took place in a high-security briefing room overlooking the bay. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine from the outdoor planters and the sterile, recycled oxygen of the facility. Seated around the curved table were the titans of the Federation: Admiral Nechayev, sharp and impatient; Admiral Talara of Vulcan, her face a mask of logical indifference, and several civilian counselors. "Mr. Rasputin," Nechayev began, her voice cutting through the room like a phaser beam. "Dr. Bashir's reports suggest you possess extraordinary psionic capabilities. You've demonstrated cellular regeneration and neural manipulation. In a time of war, such abilities are of significant interest. We want to know the extent of your power, and we want to know if you are willing to serve the interests of the Federation." Rasputin did not sit. He walked to the window, his long, dark shadow stretching across the polished floor. He looked out at the shuttlecraft flitting like dragonflies across the sky. "The Federation," he murmured, the name sounding like a prayer and a curse. "You speak of interests and powers as if they are coins to be traded. You ask if I will serve, but you do not ask why you are so afraid." "We are in a state of war, Mr. Rasputin," Talara interjected, her voice cool and rhythmic. "The Dominion poses an existential threat to our way of life. Fear is a biological response to danger. Logic dictates we seek every advantage." Rasputin turned. His eyes seemed to darken, the blue turning to a deep, bruised violet. He walked toward the Vulcan admiral, his steps silent. Talara did not flinch, but Sisko noticed the slight tightening of her hands on the table. Logic, Rasputin spat the word as if it were bitter. You use it as a shield to hide the rot. You, daughter of the desert. You have suppressed your fire for so long you have forgotten its heat. But I see it. It is a small, cold coal in the center of your being, screaming for the wind. This is irrelevant, Talara began. But Rasputin placed his hand on the table, inches from hers. A low hum, similar to the one Dax had recorded in the lab, began to vibrate through the floor. The holographic displays around the room flickered. Rasputin wasn't just speaking, he was projecting. He was forcing the room to feel the weight of his reality. I see the mothers of San Francisco, Rasputin said, his voice rising to a melodic, terrifying crescendo. I see them smiling in their gardens, while 3 sectors away, their sons are being turned into ash by Jemadar beams. I see the tosser of this world, your president, who speaks of peace while he signs the orders for 1,000 more ships to be built. You have a sickness here, not of the body, but of the will. You have forgotten how to suffer, and so you do not know how to win. He moved toward Admiral Ross. The admiral stood his ground, though his breathing had become shallow. Rasputin reached out and touched the gold pips on Ross's collar. You, Rasputin whispered, you are the most honest man here. You carry the deaths of 10,000 soldiers in your pocket. It is heavy, isn't it? It keeps you awake. It makes the wine taste like vinegar. Ross swallowed hard. Someone has to make the decisions, Grigori. Then let me help you, Rasputin said, his voice suddenly dropping to a whisper of pure, intoxicating silk. The Federation's doctors can heal a broken bone, but they cannot heal a broken heart. They cannot give a man the certainty of his soul. I can. Rasputin turned back to the council. He spread his arms wide, his shadow engulfing the center of the table. You think the Dominion is your enemy? No. Your enemy is the void within you. You have replaced God with a computer. You have replaced the spirit with a treaty. Give me your wounded. Give me the men who have seen the dark and cannot find their way back. I will show them that there is a power greater than the founders, a power that lived in the mud of the earth before your ancestors learned to walk. The room was silent. Even Nekhaev seemed momentarily stunned by the raw, charismatic force of the man. Sisko felt a surge of genuine alarm. He had seen this before in the history books, the way Rasputin had bypassed the ministers and the generals to speak directly to the soul of the Tsar. He was doing it again. He wasn't arguing policy, he was offering absolution. We will. Consider your proposal, Ross said, his voice shaky. For now, you will be housed at the Vulcan embassy. It's a controlled environment, away from the public eye. The eye is already watching, Rasputin said, looking directly into the security camera in the corner of the room. He knew that somewhere, in a basement in Virginia, or on a cloaked ship in orbit, the men of Section 31 were watching. He knew they were the true Okhrana of this empire, the secret police who worked in the dark. And he knew they would be the first to come knocking. As Sisko led Rasputin out of the room, he leaned in close. You're playing a dangerous game, Grigori. These aren't the Romanovs. This is a democracy. Rasputin laughed, a dry, rattling sound. A democracy is just a palace with more doors, great Tsar. But the people behind them are just as lonely, and just as hungry for a miracle. Back in his guest suite, Rasputin stood on the balcony. He watched the lights of San Francisco sparkle in the twilight. He could feel the collective anxiety of the city, a million souls vibrating with the hidden fear of the war. He closed his eyes and began to hum, a low, resonant frequency that seemed to harmonize with the very crust of the earth. In a veterans' hospital 10 miles away, a soldier who hadn't spoken since the Battle of Tyra suddenly sat up in bed. He looked at the nurse and spoke one word: believe. The infection had reached the heart of the Federation, and Rasputin, the holy man of the Neva, was only just beginning to tighten his grip on the pulse of the future. The Vulcan embassy in San Francisco was a marvel of brutalist elegance. Sharp angles of red stone and cooling water features designed to evoke the heat of Vulcan while maintaining the quietude of a monastery. For most, it was a place of meditation. For Grigori Rasputin, it was a cage made of logic, a concept he found more suffocating than the iron chains of the Neva. He paced the length of his meditation chamber, his bare feet slapping against the stone. The Vulcans had tried to teach him their techniques for mental discipline, but he had merely laughed, telling the high priest that they were trying to put the sun in a bottle. He knew he was no longer alone before the door even hissed open. The air in the room didn't just change temperature, it changed intent. The Tsar of the Federation and his generals were men of the light, but the man who stepped through the shadows of the entryway was a creature of the soot. He was dressed in a plain, dark civilian suit that seemed designed to be forgotten the moment it left one's sight. His face was unremarkable, the face of a clerk or a secondary school teacher, but his eyes were as cold and empty as the space between galaxies. "Grigory Rasputin," the man said. His voice was a flat, cultured monotone. "My name is Luther Sloan. I represent a branch of Federation interests that doesn't appear on any organizational chart." Rasputin stopped his pacing. He turned slowly, his long beard casting a jagged shadow against the red stone wall. He didn't look at Sloane's face, he looked at the space just behind his left shoulder, where the man's pach, his life force, should have been. He saw nothing but a void, a black hole wrapped in the flag of necessity. "The Okhrana," Rasputin whispered, referring to the secret police of the Tsars. A wide, yellowed smile split his face. "I was wondering when the men of the cellar would arrive. You have the smell of damp earth and old blood on you, Mr. Sloan. It is a comforting scent. It reminds me of home." Sloan did not smile back. He walked into the center of the room, pulling a small, black cylindrical device from his pocket and placing it on the stone table. It emitted a faint, high-pitched whine that caused the air to shimmer. "This is a multiphasic dampening field. It ensures that neither the Vulcans nor my own colleagues at Starfleet Intelligence can overhear us. It also, theoretically, should suppress the psionic broadcast you've been using to inspire the local population." Rasputin felt the field. It was like a thin, itchy shroud being pulled over his mind, trying to muffle the roar of the universe he constantly heard. He closed his eyes and breathed in deeply, his chest expanding like a bellows. "You think your little toy can silence the voice of the spirit? You are trying to stop a flood with a spoonful of sand." "I'm a pragmatist, Grigory," Sloan said, leaning against the wall. "I've spent the last 48 hours reviewing Dr. Bashir's medical data and Commander Dax's sensor logs. The Federation Council sees a holy man. The Vulcans see a biological anomaly. I see a strategic asset. The Dominion War is not going well. Morale is flagging. The civilian population is starting to question the cost of our survival. We need a unifying force, something transcendent." Rasputin laughed, a deep, mocking sound. "You want to use the monk to keep the peasants in line. You want me to tell them that their suffering is holy, so they will continue to die for your Federation. You are no different from Prince Yusupov, only your palace is made of stars." "I am very different from the prince," Sloan replied coldly. "The prince wanted to save a dynasty. I want to save a species. And I'm prepared to be much more thorough. We've been experimenting with certain neural link technologies. We believe that if we can map the exact frequency of your psionic output, we can amplify it. We could broadcast a sense of calm, of absolute certainty and loyalty, across an entire star system. We call it the Resurrection Protocol. You would be the heart of it. The saint of the Federation." Rasputin walked toward Sloan, his eyes burning with an intensity that seemed to push against the dampening field. The black device on the table began to vibrate, its internal components whining under the strain. "And what if the saint says no? What if the monk prefers to speak his own words, rather than the ones you write for him in your dark rooms?" Sloan reached into his jacket and pulled out a small holographic projector. He activated it, and a shimmering image appeared in the air between them. It was a complex biological schematic, a strand of DNA being manipulated by a series of glowing microprobes. "We don't actually need the monk, Grigory," Sloan said, his voice dropping to a whisper of pure clinical ice. "We only need the biology. We have your blood samples from the infirmary. Our laboratories in Section 31 are already working on a viable clone, a version of you without the erratic personality, a vessel we can control. If you cooperate, you live in luxury as the public face of this new faith. If you don't, you become a footnote in a history book that will never be written." Rasputin looked at the holographic DNA. To his eyes, it looked like a twisted ladder leading down into hell. He felt a surge of genuine, righteous fury, not for himself, but for the sacrilege of it. These men of the future didn't just want to rule the world, they wanted to manufacture the soul. You speak of clones, Rasputin growled, his voice vibrating with a power that made the water in the meditation pools begin to ripple and boil. You think you can craft a man in a jar and call him a servant of God? You are children playing with the bones of your ancestors. Suddenly, the dampening field device on the table exploded in a shower of sparks and molten plastic. The high-pitched whine vanished, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Rasputin didn't move, but the air around him began to glow with a faint, sickly green light, the color of the Neva at midnight. Sloane stumbled back, his hand going to a hidden weapon in his belt, but his fingers refused to move. He looked down and saw that his hand was trembling, the muscles spasming as if they were being plucked like harp strings. You want to see my power, little man of the shadows? Rasputin stepped into Sloane's personal space, his face inches from the operative's. You want to know what the spirit thinks of your jars and your wires? Sloane gasped, his vision blurring. He didn't see the room anymore. He saw a frozen river. He felt the weight of iron chains around his neck. He felt the lungs-bursting agony of the icy water of 1916. For a moment he was Rasputin, dying in the dark, feeling the tearing of the universe. I have died once already, Rasputin hissed, his eyes filling with a terrifying ancient light. Your Section 31 is a grave, and you are already a corpse. Do not threaten the man who has walked through the fire and come out the other side. The vision snapped. Sloane collapsed to his knees, retching, the cold sweat pouring off his face. The room returned to its sterile, Vulcan calm. Rasputin stood over him, looking down with a mixture of pity and contempt. Go back to your cellar, Mr. Sloane, Rasputin said, his voice now calm and melodic again. Tell your masters that the saint is not for sale, but tell them this as well. I know where you hide. I can hear your hearts beating in the dark, and when the time comes, I will be the one who decides who is resurrected. Sloane scrambled to his feet, his composure shattered. He didn't look back as he fled the room, the hiss of the door sounding like a gasp of relief. Rasputin walked to the window and looked out at the spires of San Francisco. He could feel the eyes of the hidden cameras on him, but he didn't care. He knew now that the Federation wasn't just a beautiful tomb, it was a kingdom in search of a master. Sloane had offered him the chance to be a weapon, but Rasputin had no intention of being anyone's tool. He reached out his hand and touched the cold glass of the window. In the distance, he could feel a new presence, a cold, mechanical hunger, approaching from the depths of space. The Dominion. He could hear the drums of war beating in the subspace layers of the galaxy. The storm is coming, Rasputin whispered to the glass. And when the lightning strikes, they will all come crawling to the monk. Even the men of the cellar. He closed his eyes and began to hum, his mind reaching out across the light years, searching for the pag of the enemies of this empire. He wanted to know the taste of the founders. He wanted to see if their gods were as hollow as the ones he had already broken. Deep Space Nine had become a focal point of a different kind of war, one of nerves and shadows. The station was currently playing host to a high-level diplomatic delegation from the Cardassian Union. Despite the growing threat of the Dominion, the Central Command was still clinging to its pride, sending Legate Tyrell, a man whose skin was the color of a bruised sky, and whose neck ridges were as sharp as the obsidian blades his people favored. The negotiations were stalled. The Cardassians demanded territorial concessions in exchange for a non-aggression pact that everyone knew was written in disappearing ink. Captain Sisko sat at the head of the conference table, his eyes weary. Beside him sat Rasputin. The Mad Monk had been returned to the station by Starfleet Command under a joint observation mandate. They didn't know what else to do with him. He was too dangerous to keep on Earth and too valuable to let go. He sat in the chair like a vulture perched on a golden branch, his dark robes a stark contrast to the sharp gray uniforms of the Cardassian officers. The Federation's insistence on neutral zones is a sentimental luxury we can no longer afford, Captain, Legate Tyrell said, his voice a dry rasp. He coughed into a silk cloth, a tremor running through his hand. The Dominion does not respect lines on a map, they respect strength, and Gondra 7th is a Cardassian world by right of history. Rasputin leaned forward, the light of the overhead lamps catching the oily sheen of his beard. He didn't look at the maps or the PADDs on the table. He looked at Tyrell's neck. He looked at the way the legate's pulse was thrumming erratically against the gray ridges of his throat. You speak of strength, man of stone, Rasputin whispered, his voice slicing through the diplomatic jargon. But you are a hollow tower, You have built your walls so high that you have forgotten the rot in the foundation. Turrell stiffened, his eyes narrowing. Captain Sisko, I was told this primitive was a guest. I did not realize he was allowed to insult the representatives of the Union. Mr. Rasputin is an advisor, Sisko said, though the lie tasted like ash. Grigori, stay on the topic of the sector boundaries. The boundaries are in his blood, great Tsar, Rasputin said, standing up. He walked around the table, the Cardassian guards reaching for their holstered disruptors. Sisko raised a hand, signaling them to hold. Rasputin stopped behind Turrell, placing a long, spindly hand on the legate's shoulder. Turrell tried to pull away, but he suddenly found himself unable to move. It wasn't a physical restraint. It was as if his nervous system had simply received an order to cease all voluntary motor function. His breath hitched in his chest. You have the shaking of the bone, do you not? Rasputin murmured into Turrell's ear. The Kala Nora syndrome, a gift from the Bajoran labor camps. You thought you were the master, but the dirt of the oppressed has found its way into your marrow. It is eating you from the inside out, turning your blood to vinegar. The room went silent. Kala Nora was a death sentence, a rare respiratory and neural decay. For a Cardassian legate to admit to such a weakness would be political suicide. It is a lie, Turrell hissed, though his face had turned a sickly shade of pale. A Bajoran myth. Is it? Rasputin's hand began to glow. This time, the light wasn't the soft luminescence he had shown the Bajorans. It was a harsh, vibrant emerald, the color of a star, in the final moments of its life. Your doctors give you injections to hide the tremors. They give you gas to clear your lungs. But they cannot talk to the cells. They cannot tell the body that it is forgiven. Rasputin's fingers dug into the ridges of Turrell's neck. The legate let out a strangled cry, his head snapping back. Sisko stood up, reaching for his phaser. Rasputin, back away. But Turrell wasn't fighting. He was gasping, his eyes rolling back in his head. The emerald light seemed to flow from Rasputin's fingertips, entering the Cardassian's skin like liquid fire. The sensors in the room began to chime. High-energy psionic discharge, synchronized with a massive surge in the legate's cellular metabolism. Suddenly, Turrell let out a long, shuddering breath. He slumped forward, his forehead hitting the table. Rasputin stepped back, his face glistening with sweat, his eyes wide and triumphant. The stone is cracked, Rasputin wheezed. But the water flows again. Turrell sat up slowly. He looked at his hands. They were steady. He took a deep, rattling breath. And then another, this one clear and effortless. He touched his chest, his eyes filling with a look of profound, terrified wonder. The chronic pain that had been his constant companion for a decade was gone. How? Turrell whispered, looking at Rasputin as if the monk were a ghost. Our best scientists said it was irreversible. The neural pathways were necrotic. Your scientists look at the machine, Rasputin said, wiping his brow with his sleeve. I look at the ghost in the machine. You Cardassians, you are a people of order. You love your families. You love your state. You carry a mountain of guilt for what you did to this world, but you call it duty. I simply took the weight of that duty from your shoulders for a moment. I told your body it was allowed to live. The Cardassian guards looked at each other, their discipline wavering. They had seen their legate, a man of iron, reduced to tears of relief by a man who looked like he belonged in a medieval dungeon. This changes things, Turrell said, his voice regaining its command, though the edge of arrogance was gone. He looked at Sisko. Captain, the negotiations regarding Gondra 7 are suspended. I must consult with the Central Command, but I wish for Mr. Rasputin to accompany me to the Cardassian embassy on the station. He has skills that the Union may find useful. Sisko felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He saw the way the other Cardassian officers were looking at Rasputin, not with suspicion, but with a burgeoning, desperate reverence. The Cardassians were a secular, pragmatic people, but they were also a race obsessed with legacy and survival. If Rasputin could offer them a way to cheat the shaking of the bone, he wouldn't just be an advisor, he would be their savior. I cannot allow that, Legate, Sisko said firmly. Mr. Rasputin is a Federation ward. A ward? Turrell stood up, his posture straighter than it had been in years. He is a man of the universe, Captain. And if the Federation is too afraid of his gifts to use them, the Union is not. We have many leaders who suffer from the wounds of the past. If he can heal the state by healing the men who lead it. Imagine the stability we could bring to the quadrant. Rasputin looked at Sisko and winked. A quick, blasphemous gesture. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was playing the two great powers against each other, using his miracles to create a demand that only he could supply. The great Tsar is worried, Rasputin said to Tyrell. He thinks the monk will join the wolves. But the monk is already a wolf. I will come with you, Legate. I wish to see the city of glass and stone you call home. I wish to see if there is any soul left in the heart of Cardassia. As Rasputin was led out of the room by the Cardassian honor guard, Major Kira walked in, having watched the entire exchange on the monitors. Sir, she said, her voice tight, you realize what just happened, right? He didn't just heal a politician, he just gained the keys to the Cardassian Central Command. If he starts healing their generals, he'll have more influence over the Union than the Obsidian Order ever did. Sisko looked at the empty chair where Rasputin had sat. I know, Neris. I know. He's not just a mystic anymore. He's becoming a geopolitical force. In the hallway, Rasputin walked between the gray-clad soldiers. He could feel their thoughts, vibrations of fear, ambition, and a sudden, piercing hope. He smiled to himself. The Federation was a tomb of light, but Cardassia was a fortress of shadows. And shadows, he knew, were where a man could truly hide his work. He reached out and touched the bulkhead of the station. He could feel the proximity of the wormhole, the temple of the prophets. He knew they were watching him. He knew they didn't like his linear interference. But Rasputin didn't care for the gods of the sky. He was a god of the earth, and he had just found a whole new world to bury his seeds in. The heat of the Eurydia province on Bajor was a wet, heavy thing, a world away from the sterile, recycled air of Deep Space Nine. For Grigory Rasputin, the surface of the planet felt more like the mother Russia he had left behind, not in temperature, but in its soul. Bajor was a land of ancient sorrows and deep, unyielding faith, where the dirt was soaked in the blood of martyrs. He had traveled here under a cloud of diplomatic tension, ostensibly to visit the monastery at Jalanda, but his true purpose lay far from the chanting of Vedex. He could hear a sound that no one else could, a low, rhythmic thrumming, vibrating up through the soles of his feet, a call from the deep places of the world. The prophets dwell in the celestial temple, Grigory, Vedic Kwando said, his voice thin and nervous as he led the saint toward the temple overlook. Their wisdom is found in the orbs. They are the light of our people. Rasputin stopped, his eyes fixed on the distant, jagged peaks of the Kendra province. He shook his head, a slow, deliberate movement. Your prophets are too clean, little priest. They sit in their house of glass and count the seconds of your lives like misers counting kopecks. They are distant. They are mathematical. Kwando blinked, taken aback. Mathematical? They are the makers of Bajor. They are aliens who have forgotten what it is to bleed. Rasputin spat, his voice like the grinding of stones. But there are others. I hear them screaming in the dark. I hear the ones you have cast out, the ones who were thrown into the fire because they dared to feel the hunger of the earth. In my world, we call them demons. Here, you call them the Pa-wraiths. But names are just clothes. The spirit underneath is the same. The Vedic paled, making the sign of the prophets over his heart. We do not speak of the fallen. They are imprisoned in the fire caves. They are the shadow that would consume the world. Then let it consume, Rasputin whispered. That night, Rasputin slipped away from the monastery. His Federation observers, a pair of Starfleet security officers, found themselves overcome by a sudden, inexplicable lethargy, falling into a deep, dreamless sleep as he walked past them. He did not need a map, he followed the heat. He moved through the scrubland and the rocky defiles with a tireless, predatory grace, his dark robes snagging on the thorns. He reached the mouth of the fire caves just as the two moons of Bajor reached their zenith. The air at the entrance was searing, smelling of sulfur and ancient trapped malice. To any other man, the atmosphere would have been lethal, the tectonic instability making the ground groan and shift. But Rasputin walked into the red glow as if he were returning to his own kitchen. Inside, the caves were a cathedral of obsidian and flame. Magma bubbled in deep fissures, casting dancing, demonic shadows against the walls. Rasputin stripped off his tunic, standing bare-chested in the inferno. The scars on his body, the bullet wounds from Petrograd, the marks of the chains, seemed to pulse with a life of their own in the red light. He knelt on the burning stone and pressed his forehead to the ground. Brothers of the dark. he roared, his voice amplified by the acoustics of the cavern into a terrifying, inhuman thunder. I am the one who was drowned and was not dead. I am the servant of the light who has walked in the shadow until it became his skin. Show yourselves. Show me the face of the fire, the cave responded. A violent tremor shook the mountain. From the fissures of the earth, spirits of pure, incandescent red energy erupted. They were not the cool, blue-white light of the prophets. They were a raging, hungry crimson. They swirled around Rasputin in a cyclone of heat, their voices 1,000 discordant shrieks that tore at the air. A stranger, the voices hissed in his mind, not in words, but in raw, jagged concepts. A linear thing from the mud of a distant star. Why does the mud speak to the fire? Because the mud knows the truth, Rasputin cried out, his arms spread wide as the energy of the paw wraiths began to arc across his skin. He didn't scream in pain, he laughed. The prophets seek to keep the people in a dream of order. But you are the truth of the blood. You are the passion that the Tsar of the heavens fears. Give me your strength, and I will give you a voice that the galaxy cannot ignore. The wraiths surged into him. It was a collision of two different kinds of darkness. Rasputin's psionic field, already massive, began to mutate. The biokinetic energy he had used to heal and manipulate was being infused with the ancient, malevolent power of the Bajoran demons. He felt his heart stop, then restart with a violent, rhythmic thud that vibrated through the entire mountain range. For a moment, he saw the universe through their eyes. He saw the wormhole as a scar on reality that needed to be torn open. He saw Captain Sisko as a flickering candle that needed to be extinguished. And he saw the Dominion War as a glorious pyre that would burn away the logic of the Federation. On Deep Space Nine, 300,000 kilometers above, Benjamin Sisko woke with a jolt. He clutched his head, his vision swimming with visions of fire and blood. The Pogtemphar, the prophetic headache, was more intense than anything he had ever felt. He saw Rasputin standing in a lake of flame, his eyes no longer blue, but a burning, lidless red. He's found them, Sisko gasped, his voice a ragged whisper. He's found the fire caves. Back in the caves, the crimson energy subsided, sinking back into the earth. Rasputin remained on his knees, his skin now scorched and blackened in places, yet he stood up with the vigor of a young man. His eyes were different now. They possessed a depth of malice that was no longer merely human. He had not been possessed. He had made a pact. He walked out of the caves as the sun began to rise over the Bajoran horizon. The Starfleet officers who had been searching for him found him walking calmly down the mountain path. They rushed toward him, their phasers drawn. "Mr. Rasputin, you were ordered to remain at the monastery," one of the officers shouted. Rasputin looked at them. He didn't speak. He simply breathed. A wave of oppressive, sulfurous heat washed over the officers. They collapsed to their knees, their skin suddenly blistering as if they had been standing too close to an open furnace. Their phasers melted in their hands. "The sun is rising," Rasputin said, his voice now carrying an undertone of 1,000 screaming spirits. "But it is a false light. The true fire is beneath your feet. Go back to your Tsar. Tell him the monk has finished his prayers. And tell him." The temple is about to fall. As he walked toward the waiting shuttle, Rasputin looked up at the pale morning star that was Deep Space Nine. He could feel the prophets watching him from their non-linear realm, their confusion and fear radiating through the subspace layers. They had dealt with Cardassians, with Dominion shapeshifters, and with the stubbornness of the emissary. But they had never dealt with a man who could command the very devils they had spent an eternity trying to forget. The holy man had found his gods, and they were just as hungry for the soul of the Federation as he was. The air on Deep Space Nine had grown stagnant, thick with a psychic residue that even the station's industrial-grade atmospheric scrubbers could not cleanse. Since his return from the surface of Bajor, Grigory Rasputin did not inhabit his quarters. He haunted the station. He walked the upper pylons, his presence triggering proximity sensors and causing the station's computer to stutter in a loop of logic errors. To the Bajoran civilians, he was a dark saint, a man who had stared into the fire caves and returned with the embers of godhood in his eyes. To the Federation, he was a ticking chronoton bomb. But to the Dominion, he was an obstacle that required immediate removal. In the shadows of a docking ring, 3 Jem'Hadar soldiers shifted out of their shroud. They were the apex predators of the Gamma Quadrant, engineered for one purpose: the efficient application of lethality. Their Vorta handler, a soft-spoken man named Luaron, had been explicit. The human anomaly was disrupting the spiritual stability of the sector, making the Bajorans unpredictable and the Federation desperate. He was to be ended, his body disintegrated, and his soul left to the vacuum. Rasputin was standing at the end of a long, dimly lit corridor in Habitat Ring 3, staring out a viewport at the swirling blue-violet eye of the wormhole. He did not turn when the Jem'Hadar materialized behind him. He did not reach for a weapon. He didn't even stiffen. "The soldiers of the void," Rasputin murmured, his voice now a grating, multi-tonal rasp that sounded like iron dragging over bone. "You have no path. You are just meat and copper, held together by a bottle of white poison. You are the perfect slaves for a god that does not exist." The Jem'Hadar did not answer. They raised their Polaron rifles. At point-blank range, a single burst was designed to bypass Federation shielding and scramble the molecular structure of organic tissue. They fired in unison. The corridor erupted in a blinding strobe of purple-white energy. The viewport behind Rasputin cracked under the thermal expansion. Any other man would have been reduced to a fine, carbonized mist before he could even register the pain. But as the smoke cleared, the Jem'Hadar hesitated, a rare flick of uncertainty in their genetically programmed minds. Rasputin was still standing. His dark robes were scorched away, revealing a torso that should have been a ruin of charred ribs and vaporized organs. Instead, the wounds were weeping a thick, viscous fluid that glowed with a sickly, incandescent crimson. The air around him hissed as the heat of the beams met the cold moisture of his skin. Through the gaping holes in his chest, the Jem'Hadar didn't see a beating heart. They saw a swirling vortex of red fire, a pocket of the fire caves contained within a cage of human bone. "My turn," Rasputin whispered. He turned, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible, angry strings. He raised a hand, and a wave of crushing gravitational force slammed the lead Jem'Hadar against the bulkhead. The soldier's reinforced armor shattered. Rasputin didn't stop there. He closed his fist, and the air inside the Jem'Hadar's lungs seemed to ignite. The soldier collapsed, smoke pouring from his visor as his internal chemistry was forcibly cooked by a localized psionic spike. The remaining two soldiers dropped their rifles and drew their Kartakan blades. They lunged with the speed of striking vipers. One blade buried itself in Rasputin's shoulder, the other skewed through his midsection, the serrated edges tearing through his liver and spine. Rasputin didn't flinch. He leaned into the blades, pulling the Jem'Hadar closer until their cold, reptilian faces were inches from his own. He grabbed the soldiers by their necks. His touch didn't burn. It corrupted. The emerald-green light of his inherent psionics collided with the red malice of the paw wraiths, creating a black, oily discharge that began to crawl up the Jem'Hadar's arms. "You were made in a jar," Rasputin hissed, his eyes wide and leaking a dark, crystalline fluid. "I was made in the mud. The mud is older. The mud remembers," he squeezed. The Jem'Hadar, who knew no fear and felt limited pain, began to thrash. Their skin turned a necrotic gray, their veins bulging, as the Ketracel white in their systems was turned to dross by Rasputin's touch. Within seconds, the two elite warriors went limp, their bodies collapsing into piles of rapidly decomposing organic matter. Rasputin stood alone in the hallway, the two Kartakan blades still protruding from his body. He reached down and pulled the sword from his stomach with a wet, sucking sound. He dropped it on the floor. Then he pulled the second blade from his shoulder. "Odo to Captain Sisko. Security team to Habitat Ring 3. We have a major energy discharge and... My God." Odo, the station's shape-shifting chief of security, rounded the corner with a squad of gold-shirted officers. They stopped dead. They saw the three dead Jem'Hadar, one scorched from the inside, two withered into husks, and they saw Rasputin. The mad monk was hunched over, his hands on his knees. Then, the miracle began, a sight that would haunt Odo for the rest of his existence. The massive, lethal gashes in Rasputin's torso began to knit together. It wasn't the clean, surgical precision of a dermal regenerator, it was a violent, surging growth. Muscle fibers lashed together like mating snakes. Skin crawled over the wounds in frantic, bubbling layers. The red glow from within him dimmed, absorbed back into the regenerating tissue. Within a minute, the only evidence of the assassination attempt was the blood on the floor and the ragged holes in Rasputin's smock. Sisko arrived moments later, his phaser drawn. He looked at the carnage, then at Rasputin, who was now standing straight, smoothing his beard with a trembling hand. "They tried to kill me, great Tsar," Rasputin said, his voice returning to its deceptive, melodic calm. "They used their little lights and their little knives. But the spirit does not have a throat to cut. He should be dead," Odo whispered, his voice uncharacteristically shaken. "Captain, I watched the internal sensors. His heart stopped for 45 seconds. His spine was severed in 2 places. No biological entity in the known galaxy can survive that." "I am not an entity," Rasputin said, looking at Sisko. "I am an argument. The universe says that we are dust. I say that we are fire. Who do you believe, Benjamin?" Sisko didn't answer. He looked at the Jem'Hadar blades on the floor. He realized then that the Dominion had made a catastrophic error. They had tried to kill a man who had already mastered the art of dying. By attacking him, they hadn't eliminated a threat. They had provided him with the ultimate proof of his divinity. "Get him to the infirmary," Sisko ordered, though he knew the words were meaningless. "And Odo, double the sensor sweeps. If the Dominion is sending hit squads onto this station, we're no longer in a Cold War. It's started." As the security team led Rasputin away, he paused by the scorched bulkhead where the first Jem'Hadar had died. He reached out and traced a finger through the soot, drawing a crude, slanted cross. "The first sacrifice is made," Rasputin murmured. "The blood of the slave for the freedom of the saint." That night, the Bajoran shrines on the promenade were illuminated by thousands of candles. The story of the unkillable one had already bypassed the filters of Starfleet intelligence. Across the sector, people weren't talking about the Federation's tactical retreats or the Dominion's fleet strength. They were talking about the man who took a Jem'Hadar blade to the heart and smiled. Rasputin sat in his darkened room, feeling the new, jagged scars on his chest. They throbbed with a rhythmic heat. He realized that with every death he survived, the Pa-wraiths took a larger share of his soul. He was becoming a vessel for something far older than humanity, something that hungered for the fire. He closed his eyes and began to hum, the sound vibrating through the station's hull, a low, ominous warning to the gods in the wormhole. The klaxons of Deep Space Nine were no longer merely alarms. They were the rhythmic screams of a dying Leviathan. Outside the viewports of Ops, the stars were being blotted out by the sheer, terrifying geometry of a Dominion invasion fleet. Hundreds of Jem'Hadar fighters and Cardassian Galore-class cruisers had dropped out of warp, surrounding the station like a swarm of angry wasps. The Federation's reinforcements were still hours away, caught in a tactical feint near the Tyra system. The station was alone, its shields buckling under a concentrated barrage of Polaron fire that made the deck plates beneath Captain Sisko's feet shudder with a sickening, metallic groan. "Shields at 40% and falling," Major Kira shouted over the roar of a localized conduit explosion. "Automated defenses are offline. Captain, they're not trying to destroy us. They're trying to disable us. They want the station intact. They want the wormhole," Sisko replied, his jaw set. He looked at the main view screen. The great eye of the prophets was closed, a shimmering ripple in space-time that sat silent and indifferent to the slaughter unfolding at its doorstep. But Sisko's attention was diverted by a sudden, unnatural silence at the center of the command deck. Grigory Rasputin was standing by the central bio-display, his eyes closed, his arms outstretched. He wasn't looking at the battle. He was humming, a low, dissonant chord that seemed to vibrate in the very teeth of everyone in the room. The air around him was no longer just hot, it was distorting. Light was bending around his silhouette, creating a halo of dark, bruised violet. "Grigory, get back to the habitat ring," Sisko commanded, but his voice felt thin and distant, as if he were shouting across a vast canyon. Rasputin turned his head, his neck snapping with a series of sharp, dry pops. His eyes were no longer human. They were swirling vortices of crimson fire, the marks of the Pa-wraiths etched into his pupils like burning sigils. "The Tsar of the Void is here, Benjamin," Rasputin said, his voice now a chorus of 1,000 screaming souls. "The founders have come for their temple, but they do not realize the temple is already occupied." Suddenly, the station's computer let out a high-pitched harmonic shriek. "Warning. Unauthorized access to the EPS grid. Neural link established. Subspace interference originating from within the command center. He's bypassing the isolinear processors, Dax shouted from her station, her fingers flying across the panels. Ben, he's using his own nervous system as a bridge. He's rewriting the station's operating code through a biokinetic interface. He's taking control of the entire station. I am not taking it, Rasputin roared, his voice shaking the bulkheads. I am healing it. You have built a body of iron and glass, but it has no soul. I will give it mine. Sisko moved toward him, but a wall of invisible, scorching force threw him back against the captain's chair. He watched in horror as Rasputin's skin began to crack, his very flesh unable to contain the sheer volume of psionic energy he was drawing from the fire caves of Bajor. The mad monk was a conductor for an ancient, malevolent divinity, and he was using that power to seize the station's weapons arrays. On the view screen, the station's rotary phaser cannons, usually limited by targeting computers and power relays, began to fire with an impossible, erratic fury. They weren't firing beams of orange light. They were spitting bolts of jagged, emerald and red lightning. A Jem'Hadar cruiser was struck, and instead of exploding, its hull began to ripple and melt, as if it were being consumed by an organic virus. The soldiers inside screamed over the comm channels as their own genetic structure was unraveled by the Saint's wrath. He's killing them all, Kira whispered, her face pale. But he's destroying the station to do it. Inside Rasputin's mind, a different battle was being waged. He was no longer in the command center. He was standing on a bridge of smoke over an infinite abyss. On one side stood the Pa-wraiths, towering giants of flame, offering him the scepter of an empire. They showed him a galaxy where he was the eternal Tsar, where the Federation and the Dominion alike knelt at his feet, where death was a choice he made for others, but never for himself. On the other side stood a memory, the face of the Tsarevich Alexei, the bleeding boy he had healed, in the snowy silence of a world long dead. He saw the innocence he had once protected, the small, fragile spark of humanity that he had traded for the power of the cellar. You can have it all, Grigori. The voices of the wraiths hissed, a sound like a forest fire. The stars are your peasants. The vacuum is your steppe. Open the gates. Let us into the temple, and we will make you a god. Rasputin looked at the Dominion fleet outside. He saw the Vorta, the Jem'Hadar, the Cardassians, all of them terrified, all of them looking for a miracle or a master. He realized then that if he opened the wormhole to the Pa-wraiths, he wouldn't be saving anything. He would just be replacing one kind of slavery with another. He would be the czar of a graveyard. No, Rasputin whispered, his own voice returning for a fleeting second. I have played the master before. It ends in the river. With a roar of pure, agonizing will, Rasputin turned his power inward. He didn't use the station's weapons to fire on the fleet. He used the station's power to fire on himself. He collapsed the psionic bridge he had built, drawing all the malevolent energy of the Pa-wraiths into his own failing body. In Ops, the crimson fire around Rasputin suddenly turned a blinding holy white. The mad monk let out a scream that wasn't a roar of power, but a cry of profound, sacrificial pain. The emerald lightning ceased. The station's systems groaned as the power surge was grounded through the deck plates and into the docking ring. Rasputin fell. He hit the floor not as a titan, but as a broken man, his clothes smoldering, his skin blackened. The Dominion fleet, seeing the miracle cease and the station's shields finally fail, began to move in for the boarding. Sisko scrambled to his feet and rushed to Rasputin's side. He turned the man over. Rasputin's eyes were dimming, the red fire replaced by the pale, watery blue of a tired old man from Petrograd. Why? Sisko asked, his voice thick with a mixture of anger and awe. You could have ruled us all. Rasputin coughed, a spray of dark blood hitting Sisko's uniform. He smiled, a weak, trembling ghost of his former arrogance. A king is just a prisoner. With a larger cell, Benjamin. I preferred to die a man. One last time, but the sacrifice wasn't over. The Pa-wraiths, denied their entry into the physical world, lashed out one last time. A massive wave of chronoton energy erupted from Rasputin's chest, a feedback loop of the rift that had brought him here. The space around his body began to fold and tear. The rift is reopening, Dax screamed. It's dragging him back. Ben, the energy levels are too high. If he goes, he'll take the entire command deck with him. Rasputin reached up and grabbed Sisko's collar. His grip was surprisingly strong. The river. It is waiting for me, great Tsar. Let me go. Tell the people that the monk found his soul in the stars. Before Sisko could respond, the air in Ops shattered like glass. A vortex of black and silver light erupted around Rasputin. With a final, resonant hum that sounded like a Russian church bell, the holy man was pulled into the void. The command deck was thrown into darkness. When the emergency lights flickered back on, the center of the room was empty. Only a faint scent of incense, ozone, and old vodka remained. He's gone, Kira said, looking at the empty floor. Captain, Dax shouted, pointing to the view screen. Look! The Dominion fleet was retreating. The unexpected, supernatural assault from the station, and the subsequent chronoton explosion, had scrambled their sensors and destroyed their flagship's navigation. To the Jem'Hadar, it appeared as if the Federation had unleashed a weapon of divine judgment. They were falling back, the siege broken, not by ships, but by the memory of a ghost. Sisko stood at the edge of the pit, where Rasputin had vanished. He felt a strange, lingering warmth in his chest, a residue of the man's pah. He knew that Rasputin hadn't just saved the station. He had saved the Federation from a version of itself that would have been far worse than the Dominion. He wasn't a saint, Sisko whispered to the empty air, and he wasn't a devil. He was just Grigori. But as he looked at the sensor readings, Sisko saw a final, lingering anomaly. A small, persistent signal in the subspace layer of the wormhole. It was a frequency that shouldn't exist. A human neural pattern, repeating in a low melodic hum. Rasputin was gone from their time, but he had left his mark on the soul of the universe. The silence that followed the departure of Grigori Rasputin was not the peace of a concluded conflict, but the heavy, ringing quiet of a cathedral after the bells have stopped. Deep Space Nine sat adrift in the Denorios belt, its hull scorched by emerald lightning and Dominion Polaron beams, its internal systems flickering like a dying pulse. In the command center, the air still carried the faint, impossible scent of the Russian steppe, damp earth, pine needles, and the sharp tang of cheap vodka. It was a sensory ghost, a lingering echo of a man who had defied the physics of the 24th century with the sheer, bloody-minded power of his own will. Repair crews are reporting that the EPS conduits in the habitat ring are beginning to stabilize, Major Kira said, her voice sounding hollow in the darkened Ops. She was staring at the spot where the rift had closed, her hand unconsciously tracing the shape of the earring she wore, a symbol of the faith that Rasputin had both fulfilled and desecrated. But the Bajoran engineers, they're refusing to scrub the soot from the bulkheads where he drew those crosses. They're calling them icons of the unkillable. Captain Sisko didn't look up from his desk. He was staring at a single data pad that contained the final unfiltered sensor logs from the moment of Rasputin's sacrifice. Let them keep their icons, Neris. We're going to need more than phasers and shields to explain what happened here today. Starfleet Command is already breathing down my neck for a formal report. How do I tell Admiral Ross that a peasant from 1916 saved the station by making a pact with the devils of the fire caves? You don't, a voice said from the shadows of the turbolift. Luther Sloan stepped into the dim light. He looked different than he had in San Francisco. His skin was sallow, and there was a slight tremor in his right hand. A gift, perhaps, from the vision of the Neva that Rasputin had forced into his mind. You tell them the station suffered a catastrophic power surge caused by an experimental Dominion weapon, which was neutralized by a localized chronoton inversion. The Rasputin anomaly is being classified under Omega-level security. As far as the Federation history books are concerned, Grigori Rasputin was never here. Sisko stood up, his eyes flashing with a cold, righteous anger. He died to save this station, Sloan. He took the power of the Pa-wraiths into himself so they wouldn't consume Bajor. You can't just erase that. We aren't erasing it, Captain, Sloan said, his voice a flat, dead monotone. We are containing it. If the general public knew that a single human being could possess the power to dismantle a Jem'Hadar fleet through sheer psionic will, the Federation would tear itself apart. Every religious extremist from Vulcan to Batez would be looking for the next saint. We'd have a holy war on our hands before the Dominion even reached the next sector. Section 31 will handle the containment. Your logs will be redacted. And what about the Dominion? Dax asked, swiveled in her chair. Our long-range sensors show that their fleet hasn't just retreated, They've pulled back to the edge of the Gamma Quadrant. The Vorta are reporting spiritual instability among the Jem'Hadar. They saw a man survive their best weapons and melt their ships with his mind. They think the Federation has found a god. Let them think it, Sloane replied, turning back toward the lift. Fear of the divine is a more effective deterrent than 1,000 starships. But remember this, Sisko. Rasputin didn't just leave a mark on the station. He left a mark on you. You're the emissary. You felt his pag. Don't let his ghosts keep you up at night. As the lift doors hissed shut, Sisko felt the truth of Sloane's words. He could still feel the phantom heat in his chest, a resonance of the fire Rasputin had carried. In the weeks that followed, the St. Gregory phenomenon did not fade. It mutated. On Bajor, a new sect emerged, the Order of the Icy River. They didn't worship the prophets in their celestial towers, nor the paw-wraiths in their caves. They worshipped the middle path, the man who was both holy and horrific, the man who had walked between the light and the shadow. Dr. Bashir spent months trying to replicate the biological data he had gathered, but every time he tried to simulate Rasputin's neural frequency, the computer would crash, yielding nothing but a string of ancient Cyrillic characters that translated to a single, haunting phrase: "The spirit blows where it wills." In the infirmary, the woman Rasputin had first healed remained whole, her degenerative condition gone. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the station's night cycle, she would find herself standing on the promenade, humming a low, dissonant melody that made the nearby air shimmer with the smell of ozone. The Mad Monk had left seeds of his evolution in the genetic soil of the Federation, a latent psionic potential that would begin to manifest in the next generation of humans, a wild, unpredictable power that no logic could contain. But what of the man himself? In the frozen dark of December 1916, the Neva River continued its relentless crawl beneath the ice of Petrograd. The conspirators, Prince Yusupov and his men, stood on the bridge, staring down at the black hole they had cut into the river's skin. They had shot him, poisoned him, and beaten him, and finally, they had dropped the heavy, chained body of Grigory Rasputin into the depths. Suddenly, the water didn't just splash, it boiled. A violent, white-hot flash of light erupted from the hole in the ice, a silent explosion that knocked the nobles to their knees. For a single, impossible second, the air above the Neva didn't smell of winter, it smelled of the stars, of burned circuits, and of a future that would not be born for 300 years. Then, the light vanished. A body floated to the surface. It was bruised, bloodied, and wrapped in iron chains. The eyes were closed. But as the current pulled him toward the sea, a faint, emerald glow flickered beneath the skin of his chest, a final, lingering spark of the fire he had brought back from the heavens. The water of the Neva took him, dragging him down into the mud of history. The autopsy would later say he died of drowning. They would say his lungs were full of water, but they would never be able to explain why his brain, even after 3 days in the icy dark, still felt warm to the touch. They would never explain why the cells of his heart seemed to be trying to knit themselves back together, even as the surgeons cut into him. Rasputin had returned to his own time, but he was no longer just a peasant or a mystic. He was a piece of a future that had already happened. He was the unkillable one, a bridge across the centuries. Back on Deep Space Nine, Captain Sisko stood alone on the upper pylon, looking out at the wormhole. The great eye opened, its blue-white light reflecting in his eyes. He thought of the man who had called him Great Tsar and Emissary in the same breath. He realized that Rasputin hadn't just been a visitor, he had been a warning. He had shown the Federation that beneath their blankets of technology and their shields of logic, the human soul remained a vast, terrifying wilderness, capable of both ultimate corruption and ultimate sacrifice. The Dominion War would continue. Ships would burn, and worlds would fall, but the Saint of the Void had ensured that the spirit of the Federation would not be extinguished by the dark. He had given them a miracle they didn't want, and a truth they couldn't ignore. Sisko turned away from the stars and walked back into the station. As he passed the bulkhead where Rasputin had drawn his cross, he paused. He reached out and touched the soot-stained metal. For a fleeting second, he heard it. A low, rhythmic humming, vibrating through the hull. A song of the earth and the fire. He smiled, a tired but knowing expression. The Mad Monk was gone, but the road he had walked stretched on into the infinite. Conclusion. The legend of Grigory Rasputin in the Star Trek universe did not end with his disappearance. It became a whispered myth that echoed through the corridors of Starfleet for centuries. He was the anomaly that the Federation could not solve, the saint who proved that the human evolution into a higher state of being was as much a spiritual journey as a biological one. His brief, violent arrival at Deep Space Nine fundamentally altered the trajectory of the Dominion War, instilling a primal fear in the Founders that no weapon could match. While Section 31 succeeded in scrubbing the official records, they could not erase the changes in the human genome, nor the new sect on Bajor that continued to prey to the man of ice and iron. Rasputin remained a ghost in the machine, a localized distortion in the subspace of the wormhole that Sisko would occasionally detect during his duties as the emissary. He served as a permanent reminder that the universe is far larger than the Federation's maps, and that sometimes the greatest defense against the darkness is a man who isn't afraid to let his own soul burn. The monk had found his peace in the river, but his fire would light the stars forever.